All right, folks, welcome. If you're just tuning in, we're going to give folks just a few minutes to finish logging in, and then we will get started. Great. Well, welcome everyone to the latest in the Public Knowledge webinar series, Controlled Digital Lending, Getting Books to Students During the Pandemic and Beyond. My name is Meredith. I am Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge, and I've been joined by an illustrious panel of experts to talk about some pressing issues that we're facing today. So we are in unprecedented times. 48 states plus the District of Columbia have ordered their schools closed for the duration of the academic year. Public libraries across the nation have shuttered, leaving some 650 million books on the shelves, but inaccessible to patrons, researchers, and students. Over 1,000 colleges and universities have moved to online learning in response to the pandemic, leaving their students cut off from the deep, rich, and often highly specialized collections that they need in order to complete their research. How then do we bridge this gap and get the books into the hands of those who need them? How do we move collections online nimbly so that we minimize the inevitable disruption caused by the pandemic? And even outside of a pandemic, how do we bring books to those who are disabled in far-flung or rural communities, far from a library, or otherwise left behind? Today, we'll be talking about one option in particular, Controlled Digital Lending, or CDL. CDL is a technological and legal framework which allows for schools and lending institutions to digitize the works in their collection and lend them out in a controlled manner identical to a physical book loan. There's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to turn to our panelists and have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Lisa Petrides, Ph.D., CEO and founder of the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management in Education.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. Lisa Petrides here, and my organization's mission is really about democratizing access to education. And we are always looking for ways that we can bring in more diverse and equitable and inclusive education opportunities to all learners. And we work here in the US and also globally as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you for being here. Also joining us today is Cory Doctorow, author of Radicalized and Walkaway, special advisor to the EFF, and visiting professor of practice in library science at UNC-Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I wear a lot of hats, as you just heard. I've written more than 20 books, primarily for Macmillan's various imprints, but also for HarperCollins and Random House and so on. I'm also a recovering library worker, page cataloger, and recovering bookseller, and the co-owner, although no longer a participant in a successful publishing business that has paid writers for 20 years, a website called Boing Boing. It's one of the earliest blogs. And so I kind of got an in-the-round view of this. I was a WIPO negotiator on copyright treaties and have been involved in lots of different aspects of this, although I don't have a degree. I have an honorary degree in computer science and also have the library science department.
Great, thank you for being here. Also joining us today is Lisa Weaver, the Director of Collections and Program Development at Hamilton Public Library, north of the border in Canada.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Lisa Weaver, Hamilton Public Library. We've got 22 branches serving 550,000 people in Hamilton, Ontario, just an hour outside of Toronto. We've been part of Open Library for almost 2 years now, and we are so thankful for the opportunity to share that content as an enhancement of our collections when our physical collections are open, but as a core part of our collections since March 15th when our physical branches have been closed.
Great, and thank you for joining us. And finally, last but not least, is Chris Freeland, Director of Open Libraries at the Internet Archive.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, as the case may be in your location. I'm Chris Freeland. I'm the Director of Open Libraries at the Internet Archive. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit library headquartered in San Francisco. I've worked at the Internet Archive for 2.5 years. Before that, I was an associate university librarian at Washington University in St. Louis, which is where I live and where I'm coming to you from today. Before that, I was the director of the Center for Biodiversity Informatics at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And through all of my projects for the past 15 years, I've worked in partnership with the Internet Archive on scanning materials and making them available online, scanning books, starting first with scientific publications, open access publications, and then public domain materials, and now moving into materials that are in copyright. So glad to be here today. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, and thanks for joining us. So obviously, thank you for coming together today. We're here to talk about some pretty big issues, such as access to resources and educational needs in the middle of a global pandemic, which is not a small topic, but to focus specifically on controlled digital lending, or CDL. So before we get too into the weeds, I'd like to take a minute to sort of define our terms. And Lisa P., if you could just take a few minutes to kind of walk us through what is CDL, what isn't CDL, and how educational institutions have been using it.
Great, thank you. So, I'm not a lawyer, so as a lay person, what I can tell you is that controlled digital lending is really just simply based on the premise that a library ought to be able to circulate a digital copy of a book in place of a physical one. So just like libraries do today, creating this one-to-one controlled learning environment. And there are several issues that there's some great resources about. I'm sure we can be posting those afterwards that have to do with all the mechanics of the law around first sale and fair use. And there's many pieces of the law that are supporting controlled digital lending. And in terms of education, I know we'll talk about sort of pre and kind of post pandemic, but if you think about education as where, access to knowledge is just critical, in higher education, we've certainly seen the use of CDL around access to basic research and scholarly research. We've also seen it in terms of students who need course reserves. The books that are typically used, textbooks that are used for a course that many students aren't able to afford. And so a library will always have some number of versions online, hard copy in the library. And so having them online, of course, so many students are, and again, I'm not even talking about today, but were accessing things online or didn't have access to the physical library for whatever reason. They work during the hours the library is open or what have you. On the K-12 side, we have, in some ways, a little bit even more of a need in terms of controlled digital lending, which is that here in the U.S., and internationally, this is not just a U.S.-based phenomenon, that our public school districts nationwide have lost somewhere between 20 to 30% of their school libraries and librarians just in the last 15 years. In some places like here in California and Oakland, I think 30% of the libraries have been closed. Just to give you the other extreme, also in Detroit, I think it's 92% of schools no longer even employ a school librarian. So with the premise that, in fact, libraries are a source of knowledge, not to mention there's a lot of great research that shows that schools that have open libraries, I'm sorry, not open libraries, but libraries that are open to their students, in fact, show definitely a higher student success rate. So there's a absolute correlation between having school libraries accessible to students and their learning. So those are just some of the ways that education institutions have been using CDL. And and I guess we'll talk a little bit more later about sort of what's happening now that we're kind of full on into school closure.
So that's actually a great segue into talking about a little bit more of the technical side. So Chris, you're head of the Open Libraries Initiative at the Internet Archive, and you're the technical expert. So could you talk us through a little bit about how the Internet Archive has implemented the CDL framework?
Sure. Like Lisa, I am not a lawyer, so I'm coming to you from my perspective as a librarian. So I'll be speaking in librarian voice today, not in anything else. So controlled digital lending is a legal framework. It was developed by the copyright community to describe how libraries can use the physical materials on their shelves in an online environment. And so I mentioned that there's the legal framework of controlled digital lending, and we at the Internet Archive have implemented a version of that idea with our Open Libraries program. And so the idea behind controlled digital lending is this: a library can choose for a book on its shelf to either lend the physical book or the digital book, but not both at the same time. There's an owned to loaned ratio between the physical materials and the digital copies that lend. And so something that's really important to keep in mind is that these are scanned books. These are page images. These are not like an EPUB like you would be getting from Overdrive from your public library or from the Kindle store. It's a different experience. In many ways, we say that it's inferior to that experience that the average person using a Kindle EPUB has become familiar with. But it's accessible and it's available. And as Lisa was mentioning, in this moment when our libraries are closed, even that sort of inferior copy is incredibly important to make available to users. There are a couple of controls in controlled digital lending, and I thought it might be helpful if I just sort of touched on some of those controls. I already mentioned the owned to loaned ratio. So if we have 5 physical copies on a shelf, we could lend up to 5 digital copies, or we could lend 2 digital copies and 3 physical copies, but you can't go above the number of physical copies that you have. So there's that owned to loaned ratio. And importantly, that's what's been suspended, the only control that's been suspended in the National Emergency Library, which we'll talk more about in a bit. Another control is that users check out the book for 14 days. It's not anonymous. These are logged in users. You have to have an account at the Internet Archive to check out up to 10 books at a time. So it's not anonymous and it's not unlimited. You check out the book for 14 days. And when you're done with or at the end of that 14 days, if you haven't returned the book early, then you have to check the book out to read it again. And if we've gotten through all of the available digital copies, then you have to join a wait list until it's your turn to read a book, just like at your local public library. And again, it's that wait list piece that's been suspended during the National Emergency Library. And a final control is that we have digital rights management software, DRM software, in the mix to protect the redistribution of the files. And I know that there among the panelists, there are some strong views about DRM, and I can't wait to talk about those. But we have that in place because we're following what the publishing industry is doing. We use Adobe Digital Editions to protect the encrypted and downloaded PDFs and EPUBs, the lower quality EPUBs that we do make available, but we have DRM in place to prevent those files from being redistributed. And a final thing that I'd like to mention about some technical issues or opportunities. Once we've digitized these books, we make them available. We have all the page numbers and we address each book. Each page has a URL. And so we can connect places like Wikipedia directly into our books. And so we've done this now for 150,000 books cited in Wikipedia. If you go to the Martin Luther King page, Jr. page in Wikipedia is a good example of this. If you find that there's a book that's been cited by the ISBN and includes a page number, and it's a book that we at the Internet Archive have scanned, we've scanned 1.4 million books, we make that connection so that users can research something at Wikipedia, click on a citation, and go directly into the published vetted information that's contained within our libraries. That, to me, as a scholar and a researcher, is like a mind-blowing and amazing access point into our published literature. So it's one of the cool things that we can do, cool and important things that we can do with controlled digital lending as a technology.
Great, thank you so much for that. Thought we could move now to Cory. Yeah, as an author, you're sort of in a unique position among this group, especially sort of at the volume that you've written and the history, as you talked about earlier, your background in the publishing world. Can you talk about CDL sort of from an author's point of view? How do you think CDL about it? How do you think about CDL? How do you think about how the relationship it has to how people access your work?
Yeah, I've been struggling a little with what to say in these opening remarks because on the one hand, I have so much to say, and on the other hand, it seems like such a non-issue, right? I mean, I know that it's a big issue for a lot of people, but the deal for authors is that when you write books, libraries buy them and lend them out for free to people, right? Like any author who claims that this comes as a shock to them, probably not paying attention, right? So I am, on the one hand, completely sanguine about this. Modulo a few issues around the periphery, like the idea that somehow DRM will either protect my interests or, do some good for someone somewhere. I don't know if we're going to get into it. DRM could be its own webinar, but the short version of this is Section 12.1 of the DMCA that makes it a felony to provide someone with a tool to remove DRM, punishable by a 5-year prison sentence, a $500,000 fine, has been an invitation for mischief in every industry. Firms have realized that if you design a product so that using it in a way that displeases its shareholders requires tampering with DRM, that you can make it a literal felony to make shareholders sad, that you can create felony contempt of business model. This is a matter of policy. That is bad policy. And then, of course, like all DRM is broken the second it hits. The other thing that I find just bizarre about the CDL debate is that the alternative to CDL isn't that people stop getting books for free. It's UDL, uncontrolled digital lending, which is to say I go to Google and type download book name space author name and find the copy that someone has already scanned and made available. And if they haven't, all it tells you is that no one likes that book enough to steal it. So again, I'm not like all that head up about this issue, but I do think that there are serious problems both with the retail channel and publishing itself and the fortunes of authors. And my biggest concern about CDL, and I think this is on the agenda to talk about later, is that we are arguing about margins instead of arguing about the central issue. And the central issue is that now that we've shrunk to effectively one bookseller, that one bookseller has a monopsony and has its suppliers over a barrel, which includes independent authors who sell through that bookseller, but also the big 5 publishers. And it squeezes them, and it squeezes them because that is exactly what you'd expect them to do. We also have 5 major publishers, soon to be 4, because it turns out that Les Moonves, who championed the acquisition by CBS of HarperCollins, couldn't keep his hands to himself. Now he's out. They're going to flog that off, probably Simon, or not HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster. Probably Simon & Schuster will end up part of HarperCollins. And so, selling into a market with only 4 gatekeepers is not good for authors. Just as a matter of course, I am interested in how the archive, controlled digital lending, and online platforms can be part of the answer to how we reintroduce pluralism into a cultural sector that is not only older than copyright, it's also older than publishing, it's older than paper, and it's older than the codex form of the book, right? And so the idea that a technology that predates commerce itself is now in fewer hands than it was before Gutenberg is so alarming as a reader, as a writer, as a person in culture and politics, that I'm amazed that this is the part of it that we're worried about. Surely the important thing is that the house is on fire and not that we're getting smoke damage in the chintz curtains.
competition is definitely, it's a big part of it. And I do want to circle back around to that because I think there's a very robust conversation. Like even we could just have a whole separate webinar just on the consolidation issue. I also want to turn to Lisa W. Your library, Hamilton Public, has been a real sort of pioneer in using CDL to, enable greater access to works. Can you speak a little bit about your experience, how your patrons have used it, and also a little bit, we actually had a question coming from the Q&A about interlibrary loan and kind of what your thoughts are on that.
So one of the things that happened in Ontario was that there used to be a central service that used to move all resources throughout the province for interlibrary loan. And one of the government cuts that happened led to the stop of that. And it was actually just about the time that we started our relationship with OpenLibraries. And so we are so thankful that when customers contact us for books, we are often able to refer them to that digital copy for those customers who do have access to the internet and choose to access the resource in that way. One, we believe that's a great environmental impact, not having a truck move around to move those titles around, but also the immediacy of that. And then I would echo a lot of the things that Lisa P. has said. The open library for us really has become an equity piece where it costs money to take the bus to the library. And sometimes if you need that one page, that one chapter, that one reference to finish it, the open library has provided a lot of our customers that access. The other thing with the open library, in addition to our other digital collections, it is a collection that's available 24/7 and on snow days. So again, as long as you have access to the internet at home, you're able to access those resources. We've heard from some of our customers that the book got lost in between the school and the house. I'm not sure if it's at the bottom of the locker or the bottom of the knapsack or left on the bus seat, but Open Library has saved some people from getting that project done or the assignment in on time. So we are also thankful for that. And again, talking about equity, we have been so fortunate to have a great relationship with our local Indigenous community on the Six Nations Reserve, and they have also enjoyed reciprocal borrowing with our library and have been users of our open library collection as well. And so no matter young or old, people are appreciating access to that collection, and even more right now when novel studies are still going on. Those physical collections in school libraries and public libraries have been closed here since March 15th. School's not opening here until the fall. People are still reading, whether it's for pleasure or for research, and open library is a core part of our strategy with the National Emergency Library right now to make sure that people can do what they want to be doing, again, whether it's for pleasure or for research.
Excellent, thank you. So we got a couple of questions coming in the Q&A that I just wanted to address pretty quickly. So one was for Chris, said when you said the scan pages of the print books were accessible, did you mean in the context of available or accessible in the context of accessibility for print disabled readers? Just a clarifying question.
Yeah, the answer is yes. It's both. And so we have a URL directly to a page, and our pages, our page images, and our files are available for use by the print disabled community. We make DAISY files, which are encrypted files specific for blind users, and our interfaces. Though I mentioned that it's inferior to a high quality EPUB, you can still use the controls within the page to zoom in, see greater detail. So the file is both accessible as well as made available through accessibility means.
Great. Okay, sort of shifting gears a little bit. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room is the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything is different. Some things are surprisingly still the same. But we've really undergone a seismic change, in the urgency of this question and how we get these books to the people who need them. How do we minimize the disruption created by these mass closures in all these different areas? So Lisa P., I wonder if you could start off by talking a little bit about the kinds of needs that you're seeing coming from the educational community in response to this.
Yeah, Meredith, it's interesting. You said sort of everything is different. And I guess in some ways I want to say everything is different, but in some ways everything remains the same except exacerbated. So for example, just in K-12 education, as I mentioned earlier, the loss of school libraries already were having a direct impact on literacy and on learning. So the fact that, teachers during COVID, left their classrooms, left their stacks of, textbooks on their bookshelves that they were using in their courses, not to mention, often in a school, there'll be a set of books that's enough for 30 students, but that teacher teaches that class 4 different times. And so there weren't enough books to go around in the first place, right? To take home, and now they're not even accessible. So you can see this is a very significant way that access to CDL is really an imperative around schools. The second piece too is around parents who are home and trying to help their students, their children on their lessons, and they're looking for resources as well. They're not versed on all the topics that necessarily their teacher was doing, and if they're trying to help and tutor their children, it's not only for educators and students, but the parents as well. On the higher ed situation, again, like I said, it's sort of exacerbated an existing situation. There's been some really interesting studies that have showed about 50 to 60% of students and college students actually buy the textbooks for their class. And it's typically around an affordability issue. And there's a lot of work that we do around open educational resources and public domain, which is not the topic of this, but you can see where CDL is very much filling that need if a college course is not already using an openly licensed textbook. It's essential that students will have access to these books. As I mentioned earlier, just course reserves in a library any librarian knows that these are high in demand, always checked out, and really causes the difference between a student having that textbook available to them or not is absolutely the difference between not just a good grade or not, but often a pass or fail or withdrawing from that class. So there's the pandemic has really shone a light on a situation that has already been very problematic. And so I think what it's done in some ways is really brought to light the fact that something like controlled digital lending is filling a huge gap that was already there.
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable situation, like you said, really just exacerbating a lot of the difficulties that existed beforehand, and we've moved online, and I think a lot of people just assume that all of a sudden everyone is magically fully resourced to acquire the textbooks that they would need and to be able to pay for them, and then potentially to pay a second time for an online edition if that's what they need. Lisa W., can you talk about sort of what kind of needs are you seeing in the library community right now to reach out to your patrons?
We've been lucky with our public school board, our Catholic school board, and our private schools, and even our homeschooling. We created a learning links page that allowed customers immediately to have access to online content, including the Open Library, and then a few weeks later, the National Emergency Library. In the chat, we're going to be posting a link that shows our catalog vendor has set it up. So now when people search our library catalog, all the digital content comes up first. And included in that digital content is our links to the Open Library collection. So customers are 100% successful when they are searching our library catalog right now and finding content that's available. Traditionally, you'd be successful in finding physical copies, placing them on hold, or downloading copies. Right now, you'd be unsuccessful if the catalog was only solely taking you to print copies, because we cannot provide access to those right now. So we have been so fortunate. A lot of teachers called us and told us about the hundreds of copies of titles that they were going to be handing out next week for the novel study or the project or the group study. And again, the National Emergency Libraries allowed us to ensure that those customers have access to those titles in the format that works for them. And it's great that kids can access it on a computer, a tablet, a phone, again, whatever the device of their choice is. And even in some cases for group read alouds, it's just nice for the kids who choose to have that page open. And I'm sure that Lisa P. would agree, depending on what kind of a learner you are, sometimes it's that auditory, but sometimes that auditory and having the text in front of you just helps further enhance your learning, or just having it there again for reference. Did the author really say that? Did the teacher really read out that line? So much differentiated learning that the Open Library consistently supports, but definitely, again, as Lisa P. said, completely exaggerated now that it's that shared learning environment for everybody.
Absolutely. And Cory, you know, sort of kicking back to the author's perspective, has the pandemic really changed at all how you think about, you know, being able to get your works into people's hands? I know you kind of come at it with a very unique perspective, but how has this changed, if at all, kind of how you think about increasing access and pushing out your work?
Well, this is where I have more sympathy for people who are upset about NEL, not because of NEL, but because of being upset. I mean, this is a very upsetting time for authors. It's not been an easy time to be an author, an easy generation to be an author in, but in particular, you know, I've got 3 books coming out this year from Macmillan. I had 6 tours scheduled in the US, Canada, the UK, and Germany. I'm sure none of those tours are going to happen. Every festival I was headlining has been canceled. All of the bookstores that I was meant to do appearances in are shuttered, and no one can figure out how to sell books. And so I get that this turns your blood to ice water, right? When this happens, I understand why publishers who, you know, the corporations are super concentrated. The people who work in them earn basically subsistence wages because they live in New York City, right? So anything short of a very, very large wage is a subsistence wage. They've effectively taken a vow of poverty to bring literature to the world. And so everybody is super worried and frightened. And I am right there with them. I am super worried and frightened. You know, my ability to pay my mortgage for the next couple of years is on the line here. I spent years and years writing those 3 books. In the case of the picture book I've got coming out this year, I started that project in 2010. And it is really, really frightening. I just think that we're lashing out at the wrong place. I mean, yes, as an author, I write to be read. And of course, it's very good to know that readers can get my books online and through libraries, either through you know, the National Emergency Library or through their local public library system. I'm fortunate that my books are very well represented in the electronic collections of major library systems. And so I hear from lots of readers who are reading my books that way. But at the same time, you know, this is a moment of precarity at the end of a long period of precarity with no end to precarity in sight. And I am very, very sympathetic to it. I just don't think that beating up on libraries solves that. I think that it just it takes 2 entities that should be working together and drives them apart. And I am very mindful of the fact that in every justice struggle in our history, particularly labor struggles, that pitting different groups of people who actually have aligned interests against each other has been a historically very successful tactic for keeping both of them from realizing their fair share of the fruits of their labor. And just as nobody becomes an editor at a New York house with dreams of riches, so too does no one go to library school to make big bank off of big library. We are all the people of the book here, right? You know, like, and I just think it's we should be allies in this moment and not adversaries.
So that's a really interesting point. I think you touched on a lot of the anxieties, obviously, that a lot of folks are feeling right now and feeling very acutely, specifically within the writing community. And I guess that actually leads us pretty neatly into my question for Chris, which is, what is the sort of reality of the use patterns that you guys are seeing? And then the National Emergency Library has been online for about 2 months now, about 8 or 9 weeks. And, you know, you've been getting some really sort of interesting data on the use patterns of how people have checked these books out and what they're reading and how long they're reading them for. So can you kind of walk us through how are the end users actually engaging in this kind of borrowing? And does it really compare to the kinds of activity that you'd see that would drive people to going out and like maybe buying an ebook through Amazon?
Yeah, thanks for that that prompt, Meredith. So Michelle, working behind the scenes, has posted some links into the chat, and we wrote a blog post 2 weeks after the launch of the National Emergency Library to give people a bit of an understanding of what we were seeing in terms of the usage patterns, and so that link is there. What I'd say is that the way that people use our books and books online, I think in general, but specifically the way that people use the books that we've made available through controlled digital lending is fundamentally different than your like beach reading on your Kindle or reading a novel. People are in and out of our books in less than an hour. So we found that something like less than 10% of our users stay in a book for more than 30 minutes. Or to turn that around, the vast majority of users are reading a book, looking at a page, using the book for research. Think of our collection kind of like as a reference library, and the way that I described our connections to Wikipedia. Again, people are just in and out of the book. They're not consuming it from start to finish. That just doesn't happen in our. It happens very rarely in our environment. Something that's important too, the National Emergency Library, we don't have books that were published in the past 5 years. So when we look at the range of dates of what's being used, it's really fascinating. It's more than 90% of the books that are borrowed from the National Emergency Library were published more than 10 years ago, and 2/3 of the books were published in the 20th century. So when we look at what are people really coming to the Internet Archive for, and coming to the National Emergency Library, where are we filling a gap in the information ecosystem? It really is in the 20th century literature, the things that aren't widely held, that are niche topics held in academic libraries, held by a couple of possibly public libraries, things that just aren't widely available. We had a great example from, I think it was the first week or two of the National Emergency Library, with a librarian who was able to find a book for a student. It was called Indigenous African Architecture, that was published in 1976. Like, there are 2 copies of that book sort of available in libraries, and they were not anywhere near where this student was. The student was able to get that book and do their term paper while the library was closed. And again, regardless of whether the library had been open or not, they simply wouldn't have access to that material because it's just so rare or not widely held. That, to me, is the real power of controlled digital lending. It's those things that are of interest to specialist communities and not widely held. We also then posted a blog post that just went online today. The title is somewhat fun. We were trying to get like summer in the title or some way, but it's Sizzle Then Fizzle, Buzzy Titles and Borrowing Digitized Books. And basically what we've used a couple of examples of books that had a lot of interest, like of the moment interest. One of them is Sylvia Browne's End of Days, where there's a quote, this is a prediction, that there would be a pneumonia-like virus in 2020. And this went viral, no pun intended, online, because it was popularized by a couple of influencers. And so there's a lot of interest in that book, but no one checks it out. So they look at the page, they're in and out, and then they move on. They're not really interested in the book. They're not really interested in the scholarship. They're interested in the news story. So again, just to underscore this point, what we find is that we think of our usage patterns as being more akin to like a research and reference library, and also in some ways approximating the experience of when you're walking through a library, and that serendipitous walk through either a bookstore or a library stacks, where you're looking at a book, taking it off the shelf, looking to see if it's something of interest, deciding maybe it is, you put it in your book bag and you take it to the counter, or if not, you put it back on the shelf. That's that quick in and out. So it's just a different way of consuming information than if you were sitting down in front of a printed book like that you would pull off of your shelf.
That's fascinating. So, and it is interesting because we are seeing, I think, a disconnect between sort of what the fear is for many authors, which is this fear that they are like folks are checking out bestsellers en masse and then reading through them and they're losing an ebook sale. But what you're saying you're seeing is more the sort of quick in and out research, site checking, basic perusal focused on these very like narrow kinds of topics. And so I guess this is I wanted to make sure that we got to this sort of broader question that we could throw the doors wide open here, not to just talk about CDL specifically, but to kind of throw the doors open to questions, the likes of which Cory sort of touched on earlier. And you spoke about the difficulties that consolidation and concentration pose for authors. What do you think policymakers can do to improve conditions for both authors and access, be that in copyright law, be that in funding, be that in broadband access, which someone in the Q&A brought up as being sort of an inimical, it's a very tightly tied part of this question about access to books and needing access to the internet. So I just kind of wanted to throw that wide open and see, what do you think policymakers can do to better improve access and the conditions for authors at the same time? Cory, that one was for you.
Well, yeah, I had my hand up as well. So I just want to make sure that we're Iron Manning the argument of authors who are worried about this and not straw manning it. And I think that it's not, you didn't quite state their argument. So part of the argument is that they're worried that bestsellers are being cannibalized. I think there's a reasonable case to be made that that's just a tax on fame, right? If you're making millions of dollars from your books and then you make millions of dollars less a couple of dollars from your books, we can understand how in a pandemic everybody suffers together. I think their most compelling argument is that authors who are already at the margin, who see $100 a year that buys them 2 bags of groceries from an old book, that those authors are the ones who are worried about being cannibalized. And I think that, on the one hand, what Chris describes obviously indicates that this is not a displacement activity, it's not a cannibalization, but also I think that it is valid to observe that that the pressures on the retail channel and the concentration in the publishing sector itself means that a lot of good books just disappear from print, sometimes for really bad reasons. Like, for example, we know that Audible, which is Amazon's audiobook division that controls 90% of the audiobook sales in the world, they went through a period of buying up the first books in lots of series. But then those books, if they didn't fare well, they didn't produce audio for the remainder of the series. And that series is now considered basically damaged goods, right? No one wants to buy the audio rights to books 2 through 7 of a book that is moribund in audiobook 1. And so the whole series goes dead. And this is particularly a problem in science fiction, which is the genre I primarily write in. We're a series-driven genre primarily. And so it does point to, some of the problems here, which is that allowing this concentration has been a really serious issue. In terms of what policymakers can do, I think it's clear, not just from publishing, but from many different domains, that the consumer harm standard of Robert Bork and promoted by the Mercator and so on, that consumer harm standard for antitrust is a dead letter. It failed. Allowing for companies to be in charge of all of our books is not good policy. It turned the internet from this like vibrant Cambrian explosion of millions of websites doing millions of things, including promoting books, into like 5 giant services filled with screenshots from the other 4. It's a big lift to say to policymakers, we need strict merger scrutiny. We need breakups for companies that lied about their mergers in the past. We see Facebook about to buy Giphy and promising that they're not going to mine Giphy for data to improve Facebook. That's what they promised about Instagram and WhatsApp, and then they merged the backends for that. I mean, even if you were to stipulate that the collateral damage from breaking up a company that lied in order to achieve a merger approval is too high to unroll that merger, surely the only consequence, the minimum consequence that we can imagine from that lie to get a merger through is that if they make the same promise in the future, we don't believe them, right? So we should be, at the very least, reviewing the conduct remedies and the promises that were imposed on or voluntarily entered into by these highly amalgamated firms, and not ever allowing a merger that relies on a comparable conduct remedy or promise if we know that they lied the last time. You know, as George W. Bush once said, "Fool me twice, we don't get fooled again." So, you know, I guess that's my kind of big picture. I do have a microeconomic suggestion here, which is not so much a policy question as a thing that publishers, the archive, libraries, and others could collaborate on. For about 7 years now, Macmillan has allowed me to operate my own retail presence for my ebooks. So I sell my ebooks on my website. I have a simple e-commerce backend. You buy them for me. They cost what they cost at Amazon. You load them into the same readers. You can load them into your Kindle reader. The only difference is that instead of Amazon taking the top 30%, I put the top 30% in my pocket. And in fact, I hold on to the other 70% for the rest of the quarter. So I get free cash flow. And then I write a check to my publisher at the end of the quarter for the remainder. They take that remainder, they take 25% of it, which is my royalty, and send it back to me. We could, at the stroke of a pen, effectively build that e-commerce platform for every publisher. It wouldn't violate any of the publishers' deals with Amazon, because it would be the authors themselves acting as retailers. It would double every author's electronic royalties at the stroke of a pen tomorrow if we did it. And it would connect authors and readers. And of course, you know, one of the things that the NEL and the archive have is digitized versions of books that no one's ever digitized, that authors themselves would have to pay a lot of money to digitize, that could then form the basis for this. And when you combine that with programs undertaken by the Authors Alliance, where I'm an advisor, and the Authors Guild, who I've often been adverse to, but whose members I have a great deal of respect for, to automate the process of rights reversion after 35 years for that small minority of books that are still commercially viable after 35 years, you could imagine a one-stop shop where you revert your rights, manufacture your ebook, put your ebook online, make it available for sale. Your publisher, the library, the NEL, and everyone else links to that preferentially as a way to acquire a commercial copy of the book. Someone makes a plugin for your browser that every time you go to Amazon, it checks to see whether the author is selling that book direct. And if it is, it replaces the buy it with one click with a buy it with one click direct from the author button that happens all in your browser. And you basically create fair trade ebooks out of thin air. And like, you know, money talks, BS walks, right? Like you cannot put braces on your kids' teeth with indignation about the National Emergency Library, but doubling your electronic royalty rate would actually pay authors' mortgages while weakening Amazon's stranglehold on publishing, and while making authors both independent of their publishers and also cutting the publishers who are doing real work for their authors in for their share of what they're owed.
All right, that's a rock and roll answer.
More punk rock, but okay.
I channel everyone else to channel that same kind of energy. I challenge you all. So turning to Lisa W. So if you were able to lock policymakers in a room and tell them, this is what I need, this is what needs to happen for libraries to serve their patrons right now, what would you tell them?
So just echoing everything Cory just said, and two things. So I'll just one step back. As we started CDL at Hamilton Public Library, we got our own legal opinion. That's going to get shared in the chat. That is a sample legal opinion for any other public library to use as they move forward with CDL as well. In Canada, it's, you know, in one place it's called fair use, one place it's called fair dealing. Almost the same concept. Local lawyers in every area will know the ins and outs of that. And we are fortunate that there are many lawyers in our area who fully support CDL, and everybody was very interested in that legal opinion as we move forward. And I think for Canadian and American lawmakers, both of whom I've worked with on CDL, I would just focus on that equity issue. And I think both Cory and Lisa and Chris, we've all mentioned that We are librarians. We wake up every morning because we believe in equitable access to resources, whether it's a print disability, whether it's a physical disability. Open Library CDL allows everyone to have access. And if we just add on that layer of internet access, which everybody's talking about right now, Open Libraries National Emergency Library will provide that foundation of learning and recreational access for people through those resources. So while I'm not coming in the same view as Chris is about the dollars and cents, that access side and the policy around ensuring equitable access, that's what our governments are about. That's why public libraries exist, school libraries exist, university libraries exist, and hence why the Open Library exists as well.
Awesome. Lisa P., do you have any suggestions? Again, same scenario. You got policymakers locked in a room. You can tell them exactly what you think and exactly what you think higher ed needs right now.
Yes, well, we've locked them in the room. They first got beaten up by Cory, then Lisa, then me. Really, as an educator, the issue around broadband is critical. And so many people probably even on this call today don't understand that there are communities that a school serves that none of those families' homes have broadband or internet. And that means they've had no access to education since March. So let that sink in. That is very real, and that's in some ways, the utmost policy issue as well. But secondly, this issue of from the fact that we've taken a hard copy book, which is just still knowledge, right? It's still knowledge and information and course related and literacy related material, and that we somehow, when we say it's digital, that it's a different product. It's still the same thing, whether it should be treated no differently than the hard copy. That you can't borrow it or share it. That you're prohibited from doing this by law with a digital digital access. It just shouldn't be any different. Certainly in the education realm. I mean, that's really what I'm speaking to. And the last thing I'll say is that we've been working on a project, ISKME and the Internet Archive. We've got a pilot up. It's called the Universal School Library, and we have worked with a group of curators from across the country, from very diverse communities, to bring together. It will have over 15,000 really specially curated books for school libraries. And this will include around literacy, academic literacy, fiction, current events, the kinds of things that vocational content, things that students really need. And what we're seeing is that, as we're starting to talk to some states about piloting this, we need cooperative agreements between the states, the public libraries, the school libraries. These are taxpayers' dollars. When you think about CDL and the one-to-one lending, if a state, in fact, has purchased books, for their public libraries, right? That's where a lot of the money comes from. Those ought to be shared with the school libraries, who are also our tax dollars. And the number of states, Lisa W., you were mentioning this issue. We're hearing the exact same thing here. We talk to districts, we talk to state departments of education. Who owns the book, right? Well, we own the book. It's taxpayer dollars. And so from a CDL perspective, one-to-one lending is great. And of course, those books that are out of print or that the Internet Archive Library has the only digitized version, but there are also, hundreds of copies of the same book that a classroom could be using that are within a system. And so cooperative agreement could be looking at the state libraries and the school library create cooperative agreements between them so that we could really serve the USL in the way that it needs to be, the universal school library.
Excellent. And Chris, you get the final cleanup here. You get the last word as we're at the 5-minute mark. What would you say if you had, all these policymakers in a room? What kind of challenges has the Internet Archive faced in completing its mission to plug this gap for all these books and for making a CDL program generally?
Yeah, so we've gotten a lot of interest from different areas, and so it not just policymakers, which I'll address, but also from libraries. And so I think this is an important message. We you know, I'm a librarian. Librarians, we want to do the right thing. We want to be sure that we're working in the right way. And so there's some risk aversion to controlled digital lending because there's a perception that it around legal concerns. And there's a great story about this. So Michelle Wu is one of the copyright scholars at Georgetown Law, director of the library, who helped develop the idea of controlled digital lending. She's been writing on this for a number of years. And she was asked in a session that I was participating in with from a number of collection development librarians of, well, can't we just wait until there's some, you know, some legal case and that this is defined, and then we can start doing controlled digital lending with our library? And Michelle's response was, we could all wait our entire careers for that to happen. We don't need to wait. We have the tools that we have available to us now with existing copyright to make controlled digital lending a viable way of operating for libraries. So we don't need to wait. You know, the message is that libraries can join the Open Libraries Partnership. The 1.4 million books that we have available, a library can claim as their own. We can tell you, like we did with Lisa Weaver and Hamilton Public Library, which of those books we've digitized, and we can make those available to the library, and the library can make those available to the patrons by checking them out at the Internet Archive. There's also we face propaganda and misinformation. You know, the people who don't like CDL, there can be powerful lobbies, and they have money and power on their side. So it's hard to pit like the library community against some of these, some of the folks who really are, you know, not in support of controlled digital lending. And a final thing that I would say, just to echo what Lisa Petrides was saying, absolutely. You know, when we've had the opportunity to talk with policymakers, we found this really appealing bipartisan message, which is your taxpaying public have invested in that massive, a massive public investment in the materials, the printed collections that are in your public libraries, in your state academic libraries, and in your public schools. You don't have to buy it again. And especially right now, while all of those facilities are closed, your public has made that investment. Use those books, and that's where controlled digital lending fits in. And so I think this is just it's an important way of leveling the playing field for and providing, as we've all described, this equitable access to information, which has been a through line throughout my entire career, and something that I'm really passionate about and happy to be working on in this, you know, incredible moment in time.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking the time, especially those of you on the West Coast for whom I know this is pretty early. 9 a.m. Zoom meetings are never easy for anybody. But thank you for taking the time, and thank you to all our attendees for your wonderful and thoughtful questions. This will be posted online on YouTube. So if you have friends or colleagues who were interested in coming but weren't able to make it, or weren't able to RSVP because the Zoom capped out, you please feel free to forward that to them. And we will be sending all of the links that have been shared in the chat, including in response to some questions that we got. They will be sent out to attendees after the fact. So thank you again for attending today.